Anouar Majid is the director of the Center for Global Humanities, and he's also the associate provost for global initiatives at the University of New England. His work has dealt with the place of Islam in the age of globalization and Muslim-Western relations since 1492. He has been described by Cornel West in his book Democracy Matters as one of a few towering Islamic intellectuals. Majid's work has been profiled by Bill Moyers in the Bill Moyers Journal and by Al Jazeera's Date in Exile program. He has been interviewed by several media organizations nationally and internationally. Majid's essay, Can the Post-Colonial Critic Speak? Orientalism and the Rushdie Affair, published in Cultural Critique as its lead article, has become a required reading on Salman Rushdie and is taught at universities across the English-speaking world. It is listed as one of the major articles of 1995 in Year's Work in Critical and Cultural Theory 5. The themes of Islam and human rights explored in that article were further elaborated in The Politics of Feminism in Islam, published together with responses from leading scholars in Science Journal of Women in Cultural Society, considered the premier journal of theoretical feminism. Professor Majid is also an author. I'm not going to list the number of books he's written, but in early January 2012, he published Islam and America, Building a Future Without Prejudice, to help general readers understand the cultural and ideological origins of the conflicted relations between the United States and the Muslim world, and to suggest challenging and even controversial ways to move toward a more peaceful future. He's really a Renaissance man. He's also a novelist, and he has written the novel, the author, and is the author of Si Yusuf, which was published in 1992 and 2005. In late 2003, he co-founded and started editing Tingus, the first Moroccan-American magazine of ideas and culture. And you know that this afternoon, Lisa and Drew are going to be speaking about their experiences in Morocco. So we're hoping we're tying everything together here. And it's now my distinct pleasure to introduce Anouar Majid.
Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to this place. I tried as fast as I could to know the history of this place, and it's fascinating already, the Order of the Brothers of Christian Instruction and their dedication to knowledge. And I understand this was a place where a sort of college was founded before it moved to Ohio. I'm not so sure I have the full details of this. So this is a place of learning in the Christian Catholic tradition, if you will. And I'm it's a big honor for me to be speaking to you here. The topic is, when I was first asked about the topic, we were talking about the Arab Spring, religion and the Arab Spring. And as you know, it's in the news. And I'd like to tell you what I think about the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring is, if you will, the expression of centuries-long frustration on the part of the Arabs and Muslims living in that big arc, if you will, stretching from Morocco all the way at least to Pakistan, if not beyond. But if you go beyond Iraq, we're not talking about the Arab Spring and the Arab world. So we'll stay within the Arab world, which basically stretches from the Atlantic coast in Africa, which includes Morocco and Mauritania, and ends in Iraq. And in what you see in these places is nothing less, nothing short from there was a long crisis simmering in these places due to a variety of reasons. And some of the reasons I will mention today can be very controversial to a lot of people, both in the United States and most particularly in the Islamic and the Arab world. But one of them has to do with religion, and I will come back to that. The conditions in the Arab world, the social economic abysmal. There were the human development reports that have been issued early in the 21st century describe a state of civilization that is in disarray. There is very little accomplishments in the field of education. There is basically very incredibly insufficient publishing that's going on in the Arab world, let alone translation of works written in other languages. The condition of the vast majority of Arabs in terms of health conditions or the medical facilities available to treat people is also abysmal. The economy in this big stretch, going from Morocco all the way to Iraq, if you take out oil, if oil is not considered a natural resources, which is very often not of the making of the Arabs. They may make huge amounts of money out of these oil and gas businesses, but these gas and oil businesses are discovered, exploited, and marketed for them by the Westerners, the Americans and others. So there's no reflection of the know-how, of the educational capabilities or the scientific capabilities of the local populations. If you take out oil and gases, the entire economy of these places, roughly speaking, is equivalent to that of a country like Finland. It is not, so it's huge, massive, hundreds of millions of people, big chunks of land, and they're not doing much better than what Finland does, economically speaking. Again, if you take out the oil and natural gas resources. These were the conditions these are the conditions that the average Arab in the Arab world lives in. Now, of course, there's tremendous wealth in the Gulf states, in the oil-producing nations, but that kind of wealth, again, has not translated, has been able to transform the fate of the vast majority of Arabs, and certainly has not given them the kinds of freedoms that are routinely available to people in Europe and the United States. Well, and then so we have these conditions on the ground, and then there's so many others, but we'll come back to them. And then there's a lot of frustration on top of that, a frustration over issues of Israel and Palestine, the frustration over the perception that the West is trespassing on their sovereignty and rights, and there are a lot of grievances that are coming out from this, again, of this Arab milieu, and for the last 200 years, if you will, since let's start in 1800 or so, 2000 to the present, there were two where when the Arabs or the Muslims awoke to the fact that Europe, which had been in the past the primary enemy of Muslims, had reached a point of development that is way beyond the dreams or even the expectations of the Arabs and Muslims. They developed two ways of thinking about their future. One is to modernize as soon as possible and see if we can catch up with the West. See if we can basically borrow from here and there and try to change our institutions and see and develop new ways of doing education and to catch up with the West, because obviously the West is far more powerful now than the Muslims and the Arabs, and there's no way for us to fight with them or counter them or be as powerful as they are. So basically there is a realization that the Muslims lost in the battle, in the long clash of civilizations, if you will, that had pitted the two sides across the Mediterranean and other parts of the globe. And then there's another tendency which said only, and that it's not uncommon also in other cultures, that only if we could only go back to the golden age of Islam, if we could go back to the pure Islam of the Prophet and his early successors, we may be able to recoup and then and regain our strength, and from that strength be able again to revive the ancient glories of Islam and Muslims, and then be able to again, once again, catch up to, resist, be an equal partner in this sort of debate and clash of civilizations. I'm just thinking on my feet right now, but if you listen carefully to what I'm saying, you know, the defining feature here, whether one follows the route of modernization or whether one goes back to late antiquity to retrieve or to recover that golden age that had seen the birth of Islam and the rise of the great Islamic civilizations in Syria and Iraq, what we're seeing here is a preoccupation with the West. In other words, they are far superior to us, and what is the best way to catch up to them? What is the best way to, how can we regain some kind of strength so we can be sovereign and independent, and so on and so forth. The thing that they have not considered, and they still have not considered to this day, is the vast cultural transformations that occurred in European history, say between the Renaissance and the age of the French Revolution. Since the French Revolution is directly responsible for this clash, or for this, because it was Napoleon who led his troops into Egypt, and that's when the Egyptians and the rest of the Arab world were kind of stunned to see that they came, this time the Europeans came not as Christian crusaders, but as secular modernizers with scholars and scribes who are writing about Egyptian history and helping Egyptians understand their own history. You know, it was a very interesting shock to the system, both because of the power of the French and but also and the vision that they had, the ideology they brought with them. They were expecting Christian crusaders. They got French secularists. And so it is this transformation that has not happened that they have not been aware of. What happened between the Renaissance and the age of the French Revolution, if you will, that has made Europe into this gigantic power that could easily dominate the old European rival, which is Islam? Well, you know, it was a transformation that took place on many fronts. But one of these fronts is an cultural transformation. I can go through a lot of history, but if we let's say if we go to Moorish Spain, and there was an attempt there to revive or to break away from Islamic orthodoxy by philosophers like Averroes in the 11th and the 13th centuries, and when he became the first Muslim or Arab at that time to really explain the work of Aristotle. Aristotle in Greek philosophy is the one who tried to talk about ways to reach the truth. Through philosophy, one can reach when there's reason and there's faith. And so what Averroes was trying to do, he was trying to separate the two, reason and faith. They may be complementary in some areas, but there are two ways of reaching some kinds of truth. And then, of course, Muslims was in a battle in Spain, and then the theologians and the scholars and the ulamas, they again, once again, they blame the lack of religiosity and piety on the part of Muslims for their defeat, and then they turned against the philosopher Averroes and his works, and they burnt all his books. And then, but the Christians didn't. The Catholic Church didn't. They struggled with it, they struggled with it, but they condemned it in some circles, including in Paris. But eventually, they came to terms with Averroes. They called him the great commentator. And so the Aristotelian views came back into Europe, and they became a cornerstone, gradually a cornerstone of European education. So it is this kind of cultural movement that took place, which is just on around the time of the Renaissance, and that gave Europe, that eventually built on itself and eventually opened up more possibilities in European thought and culture. We have today Arab philosophers who say that basically independent philosophical thought stopped with this man Averroes in the Islamic world, which is the Middle Ages. Since then, there was a total domination of theology over Muslim and Arab minds. There's, everything has to conform to narrower and narrower theological dictates, so that people are very, very, very much restricted within the straitjacket of religion. Lots of things happened between the Renaissance and what we're witnessing today in the Arab and Islamic world. One of them is the discovery of America, for example, which was hugely transformative in world history. Except for, we don't know yet the extent of the Ottoman attitudes or responses to that, but very much went unnoticed in the rest of the Arab and Islamic world. And then the invention of the printing press. I just wrote about it recently, which was a huge factor in the dissemination of knowledge in Europe. Again, it was condemned by the Ottomans. They said no printing allowed, particularly of sacred text. So, and there was a total ban almost on printing, and there were small attempts later on, but they led to nothing. So they lost a huge amount of time, centuries worth of time, in resisting this, while the Christians and the Jews adopted the technology with gusto and went on to do great things with it. You cannot conceive of the rise of Europe without the effect of the printing press. And associated with the printing press is the ability to read and write, because now finally, books are easier to disseminate and produce and reproduce, and people had access to them. So you cannot think of the Protestant Revolution without this, and you cannot think of the discovery of America without this, and you cannot think of a lot of things that happened in history subsequently without some of this, what happened as a result of this technological innovation. The Islamic world resisted a lot of this, and the first and the first Quran, for example, in Arabic was published by Christian missionaries, not by Muslims. And in fact, the printing of Arabic was developed, the machines were developed by Christian missionaries in the Mediterranean, not by Muslims. By the 19th century, since I'm speaking in this hall, in the 19th century, Americans, soon after the American revolutions, were energized by their missionary zeal, as you know, not the Catholics, but the Protestants. I don't know who is in this church. I mean, I'm in a Catholic institution, but I don't know who I'm speaking to. Anyway, so they decided to go back to the Middle East and convert the people in the area, both Christian and Muslim, to the true Protestant faith, as you know. And so this is a great missionary movement out of the United States. So you had, as a result, people going and trying to convert, whether they're Greek Catholics or Maronite Christians or Muslims or all these denominations were kind of looked at with contempt, really, by the Protestants, because they saw them as lesser forms of Christianity. And of course, Muslims were not even Christian. So there was a huge evangelization movement going on in the Middle East. But after a few decades, they realized that the Muslims were not converting, and the Christians, there was some hope among the Christians. So at that time, the Christians converted their mission from to a secular mission, or to a social. They adopted what's called a social gospel. So instead, they started building colleges and universities, clinics, bringing in new artifacts, whether it's false teeth or printing machines or and so on. And then in a very short period of time, they transformed the region. The major universities in the Middle East today remain American universities. In Turkey, Robert College, founded by a Maynard, by the way, Cyrus Hamlin. I don't know whether you know about Cyrus Hamlin. Cyrus Hamlin is he's a graduate of Bowdoin. He went to the Bangor Theological Seminary, and then he was a Congregationalist, and then he went on a mission, and then that's when he established, he and another colleague of his, a philanthropist, Robert College. And in fact, he also founded a women's college in Turkey, and then he came back to the States, and he became the president of the Middlebury College in Vermont for 5 years, and he was the first one who accepted women into that college. Very interesting man. There are a lot of Maynards who played an interesting role in the Middle East, but that's not, I mean, they established the missionaries established the American University of Beirut, Daniel Bliss. You know, very low, very small budget, lots of effort, and they created this wonderful institution that today, sits. It's probably the major educational institution or university in the entire Arab world, despite all the billions of dollars that exist in neighboring countries in the Gulf states. The American University of Beirut remains the best university, arguably the best university in the Middle East. And so is the American University of Cairo, established by missionaries too. So what they did, they created, by establishing these universities, they began to educate people, at least an elite. And there's this elite that eventually created, that adopted forms of Arab nationalism, especially when they immigrated to America at the turn of the 20th century. And so they discovered America. And so they left their narrow sectarian identities behind, like Maronite Christians or Greek Orthodox or Muslims, and became Arab. So the United States played a role in the formation of Arab nationalism. But I'm saying this only to say that the United States has done a lot of good work in the Middle East, and it's and I talk about it in my last book, and very often unknown to both sides, and unfortunately because of the fog of war and conflict and so on. But it never stuck. Then came European colonialism, and European colonialism is motivated by other needs and interests. And then, of course, by the time the European colonists left the Arab world, like around the 50s and 60s, they had to start all over again. And then there was a series, by that time they left, they had established, artificial countries in the Middle East, whether it's Jordan or Lebanon or Libya, or a lot of countries are of recent invention. They have no historical continuity. So they had to live within, invented boundaries and create systems that to accommodate to them. And with very few exceptions. One of the exceptions would be Morocco, and some maybe Egypt. But Egypt has always been dominated by foreigners till Jamal Abdel Nasser came along in the around the 60s. So and Saudi Arabia is an interesting case, but most other countries are of recent invention. And then of course they were ruled by autocrats, people who established very powerful police systems, and surveillance mechanisms to keep the population in check. And they were totally connected to Western powers, and during the Cold War they were divided between the two camps, somewhere with the West and somewhere with the Soviet Union and the communist camp. And then by the time communism collapsed in the late 90s, or in the early 90s, of course, the world opened up, and all the contradictions and all the weaknesses were now fully exposed, and everybody was scrambling to make sense of the new world order. The Arab world now was completely unhinged, without the resources, without the knowledge, without the education, a fast-growing population. The only thing they had left, and they still have left, is religion. And religion is not enough to push them further. In fact, religion may be what's keeping them, in this case, behind. So the Arab Spring is really an expression of frustration. It was simply a vendor in Tunisia who was not treated well by a police officer, apparently, and then he burned himself, and that triggered, literally sparked and triggered the revolution. And then, of course, it caught on in other places like Egypt and eventually Libya, and now, as you know, Yemen. Now you see what's happening in Syria. In other places, it was contained through other different mechanisms. But basically, the grievances are the same. A lack of employment, lack of possibilities, lack of resources to live a decent middle-class life, which is now broadcast incessantly on satellite television channels. So I mean, it's a frustration that that's very much real, but it has absolutely no vision to guide it. So what is happening in the Arab world right now is there is no vision for the future, and I compare this situation in the Arab world to what happened with the creation of the State of Israel, for example. In the 19th century, what we had is Jews in Europe, and mostly in Europe, who were very much aware of the tremendous amount of discrimination against them. And then the world conditions were changing, nationalism was on the rise, so then you have the possibility of integration in the European cultures proved to be ephemeral because of discrimination, particularly with the Dreyfus affair, in France. So when you have Theodor Herzl, a journalist, a writer, he writes a treatise called On the Jewish State in 1896. And in that little book, he describes what could happen, what needs to be done, what is a Jewish state, why it needs to be done, and so on. It's imagined to be in Palestine, Israel, what's Israel now, and all the steps that need to be taken, and what kind of state this ought to be, what kind of society. It was liberal, it was inclusive, it's multicultural, multi-confessional. It's a very liberal vision of that state. Well, that little document, it could have been in the realm of utopian literature, along with a novel he had written at that time. It's called Old Land, New Land. And all of them really turned to be, for big chunks of that vision became reality. Now, of course, it's not, there's the abuses, they're kind of, the spirit of Herzl is not being now applied in some cases, but basically there was a vision that guided a community. It was not a religious vision. Religion is behind it at some level, but it's a very liberal, progressive vision of what to do, how to build a society, what to do with the society, and so on. Nowadays, in the Arab world, there's no such vision. People are writing constitutions. But constitutions are what comes after a vision has been formulated. The American Constitution came after the Declaration of Independence. So it's like, the Declaration of Independence sets the tone of what needs to be done. And then a decade later, people sit down in Philadelphia to hammer out a constitution. But this hasn't happened in the Arab and Islamic world. There are protests and movement, and so and people say, okay, we need to write a new constitution, and the first thing they write in this constitution is Islam is the official religion of the state. And then basically they're going back to what I told you happened 200 years ago when Muslims were confronted by the powerful Europeans and trying to decide which way to go. They come, okay, Islam is the official religion of the state. We are Muslims. Islam basically is a solution. Now they say a lot of other things in the Constitution, like about United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and the right of all kinds of rights are mentioned. But that one right there is that one principle defines a lot of what follows. And it is not surprising then that what we see now is the rise of Islamist movements in the Arab world, whether it's in Tunisia, whether Libya, to some extent, Syria. Now the Syrian revolution is daily being hijacked and by Al Qaeda type Sunni fundamentalists, and of course, and in Iraq, you could see the Sunnis are massacring the Shia every day, and you see it happening even in non-Arab countries like Pakistan, and Pakistan is a very and not just a horrifying place, all the murders and assassinations and so on and so forth. So basically, Islam has come back with a vengeance. But it never disappears. You cannot call it the return of the repressed. It's always been there. But now it's coming back in a modern guise, which is even, in some ways, could be even more vicious. What is happening then, as Islam is rising to power in a lot of these places? What is happening socially? Well, we have before the Arab Spring exploded, we had some fundamental changes in Iraq. America, the United States intervened in Iraq, and I know a lot of people were against it, but we intervened in a place that was impossible to change from within. There was a Sunni minority ruling over a majority of the Shia. If you don't know the difference between the Sunni and the Shia, I can answer the question later. But so basically, it was an apartheid regime of sorts. And so there was no civil society, there were no political parties, there was nothing. There was no possibility of any change from within. So the United States, frustrated, using false arguments, went into Iraq and broke that regime. And in the process of broke that regime, they sent people to help them write a constitution. And when they wrote that constitution, they realized that there's no way they could have a constitution without stating in the beginning that Islam is the official religion of the state. You can only be a Muslim, you can only be president if you're a Muslim, and so on and so forth. So as a result of that, but they opened up the process of voting and made it available to all the Iraqis, and so the majority won the vote, and the majority of the Shia won the vote, and now the country is ruled by the Shia, and the Sunnis are killing them non-stop. I mean, just a couple of days ago, if you've been paying attention to the media, just like horrible massacres of pilgrims and so on and so forth. So it's really very bad. What has happened since then? We could see Iraq is a lesson for the future of the countries who are undergoing the Arab Spring. There's been a non-stop jihad, call it crusade if you will, against minorities by the Sunnis. So for the Christians first, they're fleeing the country in droves. They are, the Christians were fairly protected under the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. Remember his foreign minister, Tariq Aziz, was Christian. So now it's like they declared war on Christians, and they declared war on other minorities. Don't forget that the Jews, there were a lot of Jews living in Iraq prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. Most of them left. They're practically non-existent now. The situation of the Jews in Arab lands is a very good indicator of what happened to minorities in times of conflict. So the Christians are being, really, there's a war on the Christians in this region. So the Iraqi Christians are fleeing, and this is an old place of Christianity. I mean, then what you see, then they started attacking bars, nightclubs, and places that sell alcohol and liquor. They attacked gays in several times. So there was a war on minorities in Iraq as a result of the breakup that was orchestrated by the Bush administration. So what happened, though, here's an interesting thing in Iraq. There is a democratic process in place. People vote, people elect, people get elected. That is fine. And you can have international observers, and they will be satisfied. But at the social level, see, people at the social level, at the level of the people, situation is getting worse, because the individual in Iraq, the individuals in Iraq are more close-minded than the politicians are, or than the political system is. So people are, in a way, more autocratic. It is the people. It is Joe and Susan, it is Mohammed and Layla and so forth who are autocratic by virtue of their education and their cultural mindset. They cannot accept differences. They do not accept that somebody, their neighbor, could be Christian or a Jew or an atheist, God forbid, or any other kind of person. So the Muslim or the Arab person does not know how to handle difference. And if they see difference, even in liberal societies, they try to convert that person. They say, oh, you're so nice, I like you very much, why don't you become a Muslim? And it's a constant refrain in these societies, and it's an indication of how totally unable people are, for the most part, in dealing with difference. There is no culture of equal rights, therefore, in these societies. It is very much a clannish mindset. The clannish mindset, it has been reinforced over the centuries by a particular kind of Arabian culture. And I wish I had the time, another occasion to talk about this. But Islam is an Arab religion. Just think of it this way. Islam is the religion of the Arabs. It's a religion that was developed in the Middle East. Let's say it's in Arabia. We think it was developed somewhere between Syria and northern Arabia. Wasn't developed in Mecca. But let's say it is in Arabia. It is, and if you look at the formulation, the Quran was supposed to have been written in Arabic. All the God's language is Arabic, and the prophet is an Arab prophet, and so on and so forth. It's Arabian ideology, given the mantra of a universal religion called Islam. So when that religion traveled across the globe, it took with it that sort of thing, that sort of Arab mentality and ideology, and it got imposed on everybody else. But that's a different discussion. But in the notion of Islam, there is no sovereignty to the people, which is essential to have a democracy. Islam, sovereignty is only to God. I mean, if you think about Christian history, Christianity emerged within the Roman Empire, so to speak, and it took 3 centuries to develop and eventually grow before it got recognized, and out of that, it grew into the institution that it has become. In the Islam developed very differently. There was no civilization, even if we accept the official version of Islamic history, and which I have a lot of questions about. Let's say it developed in what's today Saudi Arabia. There was no civilization there. There were tribes, and all these tribes were engaged in booty. They were on wars against each other for booty. Basically, that's how they made a living. And so that's why there was a lot of clannishness, kinship was very important because it protected you. It gave you a community to protect you and so on. There was a very interesting social structure in place. One, if we accept the Muslim version of history, when Muhammad came, he united these tribes. He united them by force initially into one super tribe, a community of tribes, and they're still involved in the same thing. They're still doing conquest for booty. Instead of now doing it against each other, let's go out and do it, let's conquer everybody else. So in no time, they were in Syria and Iraq, they're in Egypt, they were in Morocco and in Spain, and they tried to reach France. They went into France and they were pushed back, and then and so on. They tried Constantinople many times till 1453, when they were finally able to get it. But it was an interesting situation. Islam did not grow up, did not develop into a major, powerful empire with an emperor and a civilization. It developed on the fringes of civilization, and so religion and the state were always one and the same. They were never separated. So it is this thing that is going to be extremely difficult for Muslims to figure out, because they have to, in order for them to separate the two, they really have to rethink Islam very seriously. And so what is needed for a community like this, the Arab Spring? And how would the United States respond to a situation like this? What I've always argued, and I argued in my writings, is the United States can do much worse than present and highlight the ideals of the American Revolution. The ideals of the American Revolution is the best template available to Muslims to figure out their future. And I said this in circles where there are politicians from the Middle East, or I said this in in countries like Morocco and other places, and people usually get upset. They assume by saying this I'm being some sort of pseudo-imperialist, presenting once again highlighting, showcasing the West as a model for Muslims and Arabs. But the United States in the 18th century was a reasonable approximation of what is happening of the Arab world in the 21st. There was a lot of religion here. Everybody was practically Christian. And yet, if you go and read the works of Thomas Jefferson, whether it's the Religious Freedom Statute in Virginia that he composed and eventually was turned into law and was championed by Madison, or whether you read the principles in the Declaration of Independence, or in the Constitution of the United States, which doesn't mention the word God once. There's not one single mention of the word God in the Constitution of the United States, something that vexes a lot of people in the United States. But that was intentional. It's intentional, especially if you take a look at the chronology of that led to the making of the Constitution, beginning with Jefferson's writing of the Religious Freedom Act in Virginia, and then in the Declaration of Independence, and even in a few state constitutions which was circulating. So the idea, the Americans at that time, the founders realized the government and religion should be separated for very good reasons. Because then, if you don't, and then it's very common now in the Arab and Islamic world, you create a society, a community of hypocrites. Then everybody will try to outdo their neighbor in piety and religiosity. Everybody will be working with robe. Everybody will become a saint, if you will, in an attempt to outdo the next person in their piety and faith, to gain favor with the government or with the system or the establishment. The same thing in a little bit is happening in the Islamic world. Now everybody is seeking martyrdom. They're doing it in the cause of Allah. They're fighting for this reason. Allah is going to bless them if they pursue this path. If they go into Mali and amputate people's hands and destroy their shrines and destroy their wonderful historic monuments. Allah is blessing that because Allah says so in their book, and so on and so forth. So it is that's why religion and the state ought to be separated. And also, in order not to create a society of hypocrites, and not to infringe on on God's ultimate gift, according to Jefferson and others, God's ultimate gift to people, which is a free mind, the ability to be free, and so American revolutionary period has this to offer to Muslims. How did an overwhelmingly Christian society choose a form of government that is secular? It is, and unlike the French Revolution, which was an anti-Catholic and anti-clerical revolution, the American Revolution wasn't. That's why the French Revolution probably was more violent in some ways than the American Revolution was. The Americans do not have, I said this many times, I'll repeat it here, they don't need to apologize for that. It is a great gift to human civilization. If I asked you what is the one major contribution the United States has made to the world, what would you say? That's what I would say, the American Constitution. And now I met with people writing constitutions in the Arab world, from people from Tunisia and Egypt and other places, Morocco, other places. And I ask them if they took a look at this history of the making of the American Constitution. None have. I said, okay, it's just only to be, how could you write a constitution and not having taken a look at the first constitution in modern history, which is the American Constitution, the first national constitution still in existence, which is the American Constitution. The state constitution of Massachusetts precedes it a little bit, but it's the first national constitution still being used today. How could you not take a look at this paradigmatic or this foundational moment in constitutional writing in modern history, and the kinds of debates, the Federalist Papers, the kinds of debates that took place about what kind of government is best suited for the American people? These are huge debates, and can guide these nations in the process of constitution writing, but no one has, that I know of. They rely on legal scholars to come, write constitutions, and basically repeat the same claim and assumption that Islam is the religion of the state, and Islam, and so then we have these constitutional debates within the Islamic and the Arab world that say about minority rights or about women's rights, and they have all this fancy language going on. And I tell them, I say, well, how could you talk about human rights and women's rights and so on without talking about the role of religion in these constitutions, in these societies? It seems obvious to me, because religion has very clear dictates about how gender roles, and one could argue, quibble with some of them, as I did in the past, but it doesn't get you very far. You need to finally, if you adopt the United Declaration of Human Rights, United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and Islam at the same time, it doesn't make sense. One has to take precedence over the other. One set of principles has to take precedence over the other. And I think it is that kind of discussion that is missing from, that is basically hobbling, that is completely impeding the Arabs and the Muslims from moving any further. So in principle, in the end, in conclusion, and I know people will have a lot of questions, I think the biggest problem right now in the Arab world that is and that is not quite visible to a lot of observers. It is observable. People talk about Islamism, people talk about fundamentalism, but the biggest problem we have right now is Islam without the ism, without the fundamentalism, because it is a religion that at the end of the day has very clear mandates, and it creates very clear expectations, and it shapes people in very definite ways, and it produces mindsets that are in conflict, in constant tension and conflict with the tenets of modern civilization and ways of being in the modern world in the 21st century. So it is an issue that needs to be debated very rigorously with respect to communities of all faiths, because religion doesn't go away. That's my conclusion. You know, it stays. It has very powerful staying powers. Just all myths have very powerful staying powers. But even though I marvel at the ways the Greeks were able to get rid of their Zeuses and their gods and goddesses of ancient times and replace them with other gods. But basically, at least what we can do is keep religion in the sphere of the spiritual, the name of this wonderful hall, and let politics be the realm of human negotiations with all their follies and mistakes and occasional moments of triumph. Thank you.
First question.
Okay. Yeah, the gentleman is asking about the advent of modern communication and what impact it had on that part of the world. I think, you know, communication in general changed all of us. Modern systems of communication have had a tremendous impact on the way we do things, whether we are in Maine or whether we are in other parts of the globe. But it's such a vast subject that I'm going to limit myself to aspect of it. And the aspects of, you know, when I was in high school, we began to see infiltration of a particular kind of Islamist or jihadist or discourse coming through, and what do you call it? Cassettes, tapes. You know, people were playing them on their what is a boombox? What do they call them? Stereos, and they were like listening to these preachers from Egypt, for example. And I used to listen to one of them who was absolutely mesmerizing. His name is Kishk, and it's a kind of preaching that completely it can be powerfully inspiring, really truly inspiring. And if you're not paying attention, if you don't know your historical facts, if you don't have the right kind of education, I can see how people can be easily swayed in that direction. And in fact, I could even, at some point following 9/11 or thereabouts, when I was able to hear an audio recording of I don't know whether it was Osama bin Laden or Zawahiri or one of those members of Al-Qaeda, the way they speak, the way they present their causes in very medieval language, it's swords and banners and honor and all that stuff, can have a very powerful effect on the untutored mind in the Islamic world. So Arabic is a language of poetry, if you will. And because people respond very emotionally to that stuff, you know, it can be very powerful. That's number one. That's the pre kind of modern age of postmodern forms of communication. Now, what we have is Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera it's the little tiny city-state of Qatar creates this powerful, you know, television station that is broadcast across the globe. Now it's in 2 editions, English and Arabic, and I understand Al Gore now sold his concern to Al Jazeera, and it has an incredible effect on the minds of the Arabs and Muslims. Let me take the case of Morocco, and I don't have any scientific data to support this, but just by virtue of my constant trips to Morocco, and I pay attention to this. 10 years ago, you'd walk in a cafe, and they would have that in Tangier, Morocco, and they would have 2 TV sets. You know, let's say this would be the cafe. There would be a TV set there and a TV set there. On this TV set, people will be watching some Spanish channel, or some Moroccan channel, or some British channel. They watch in some kind of channel, and there'll be like maybe 5 people watching, and then on that TV set there'll be Al Jazeera nonstop, 24 hours playing, almost 24 hours from open to close of the cafe, and there'll be like 20 people watching, nonstop. I mean, they keep changing, the people keep changing, but that is what got people's attention. It was Al Jazeera. And it was disseminating a very interesting message. It is a very, I don't watch television, but it's bombastic, it's nationalistic, it pits people, it brings people together in arguments that are kind of heavily orchestrated and so people, the Muslims, somebody would be arguing with a secularist and so on and so forth. And when the question of Palestine, the net effect, the impact of Al Jazeera on that Moroccan mind watching it was that the West we need to approach the West with tremendous suspicion that the Palestinians are absolutely right in the fight against the Israelis, and that the Sunni Muslims are under siege from the Shia, from Iran, and so on. So it was they were broadcasting a very specific, Qatari ideology. Qatar, by the way, played a major role in the Arab Spring. They were actively involved in funding these Islamist movements who were toppling these regimes. They were big time in Libya to the extent that they wanted something back for their involvement. Al Jazeera was behind the Egyptian revolution. They were there, they're on site, they're transmitting the messages, they were ahead of everybody else. They played a very active role in shaping the outcome of the Arab Spring. They were not always successful, and nobody questions Qatar itself for what it's doing, but it's been this kind of operation. So you have Al Jazeera doing this, and then you have CNN on the other side. So CNN and MSNBC, MSNBC and other and the BBC. The BBC, very few people watch. It's very too cultural for most people, and. And so what you had a clash of TV networks for the Arab mind. Al Jazeera and CNN and MSNBC, and everybody wants the attention of this untutored Arab mind, trying to decide which way to go, but they all broadcast at some other level the same message. The message of consumerism, the message of a good life, the message of, because Al Jazeera, like all Al Arabiya, the Saudi TV station, which is huge, and others like it, MBC, they all showcase, the luxurious life that is not uncommon in the Gulf states. Now, a Moroccan guy or an Algerian sitting in a little village watching that stuff, they said, how am I going to get there? So they tried to cross the ocean into Spain, and they they die in the process, and so forth. So it had a very interesting effect on the Arab mind that has yet to be fully studied. Here's the interesting thing. The Al Jazeera presented itself, and still presents itself, as the voice of the South speaking back, because all the major networks globally are Western. And so they present themselves as the voice of the Southern people. Because they are in Palestine, they are in Bangladesh, they are in Iraq, they are in places that a lot of Western TV stations don't bother to go. And so they represent, they interview. If you paid attention to what happened when the United States intervened in Iraq, they were all over the place. Al Jazeera was all over the place. And they were interviewing people like in their daily lives, bakers, physicians, nurses, and the Arabs get to see that. The Americans get to see a very, very heavily edited version of what was happening in Iraq, very, very much censored version of what happened. So, and the Arabs recognize themselves in these people. So, oh yeah, I can understand that. I cannot understand that. So it had that kind of populist. Very much so, a populist sort of effect, except a new study conducted recently I don't know, it was in Tunisia or some other place. discovered that Al Jazeera is no longer popular in the Maghreb. It's ranked now 5th in terms of viewership in some places, and it's losing its steam. And another poll I received some news from Morocco says that the same thing is happening in Morocco. Moroccans are no longer looking at Al Jazeera as their favorite. It's ranking again 5th or something. Even Midi 1, a TV station that's based out of Tangier, which didn't exist as a TV station 5 or 6 years ago, now is ranked on the top. So it's very interesting transformation. And it could be that that effect is dissipating. And maybe Al Gore is a shrewd businessman. He's selling him. He's selling him the station right at the right time. So, yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Would women's role improve in the Arab world? I think if we did a lot of work trying to keep the two spheres of religion and society separate, they would. Now, what is happening is very interesting too. Modernization is more complex than we tend to assume. Forget about the typical, the usual culprits in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the burqas and all that. There are other parts of the Arab world which are less visible here. Let's take, and some are more liberal than others. I'm going to take the two cases of Tunisia and Morocco. Tunisia is the country in the Arab world that had where women had the most rights, and this from the 1950s. They had the most advanced women's constitution and protection of women's rights because they had a very secular, staunchly secular president at that time, Bourguiba. And so they lived under that rule till the Arab Spring, the revolution in Tunisia in the last couple of years. And now women in Tunisia are beginning to feel that their rights are being threatened by the Islamist movements. So they're fighting back. And this fight and this dispute that's spitting secularist versus the Islamist is happening with the same kind of intensity in countries that did not experience the Arab Spring the same way, like Morocco. There are dozens of civic organizations that are fighting for women's rights against the Islamists, and the same thing in Tunisia. And so there is people are playing tricks with the Islamists now. They're making movies that are blatantly offensive to them, or producing music in that same vein to test them and to test how far they can go in their censorship efforts. In these two societies that are relatively liberal, as far as the other countries, even Saudi Arabia, we find that they have the strange occurrence now of they're being allowed to become members of the shura, of the councils to the king, and I don't know, maybe someday one of them will drive. I don't know, but they're trying to figure out what to do basically with women in Saudi Arabia, because in Morocco it's a very different situation, as I'm sure some of our friends will mention today, and in Tunisia it's close to that. Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco are almost on a different wavelength in that region, because they are more secular. They have a very strong French influence. It's kind of stuck a little bit in some places, but the debate is intense, and I follow it very seriously. The debate between the Islamist camp and the secularist camp is very strong there, but there is no Al-Qaeda types restrictions on women, or there are different examples. Women have different experiences in different parts of the Arab and Muslim world. If you are in Pakistan, there may be one thing. In Afghanistan, another one. Egypt, again, it's a different situation. So there's no homogeneous experience for women, just like it is not for men. But by and large, if I can make a safe general statement in this hall, monotheistic religions have one could say that monotheists have a view of women and their role in society. And where monotheism is still very strong, and has not been severely contested or heavily contested, you'd find fewer rights for women. And in societies where monotheism, whether it's Christianity or Judaism, have been contested, the tenets of monotheism or biblical literalism have been contested and changed and transformed, like in the United States and Western Europe, and you'd find women have more rights, and they don't have to worry about the effect of religion on them. And then the other example you have to take a look at is the evangelicals in the United States. Now, there are many women who are part of that movement. What does one make of them? In other words, you'd find the same situation in the Islamic and the Arab world. Women who are as passionate as men are about the truth of religion, about what the religion says, about the gender is right, and so on and so forth. And how does one handle something like that? Just like people in the United States are trying to deal with the aspects of the evangelical movement, I think people in the Islamic world are trying to do the same thing. But generally speaking, the condition of women in the Islamic and the Arab world is still is much.
Sunnis and Shiites have the same attitude about women?
In terms of cultural expectations, yes. I mean, generally speaking, yes. In Iran, which is a Shia state, women have to wear a particular kind of dress. They need to function. They need to observe certain religious rules. But the women in Iran are, after the Islamic Revolution of 1979, they have progressed tremendously. So, women in Iran are far more advanced under Islamic rule than they were under the Shah. They have higher rates of education. They outpace men in most educational attainment. They have a great amount of professionals, but they still wear the robes and everything else, and they still have social restrictions about how to behave themselves and what to do and what not to do, and so on and so forth. So there is this contradiction within Iran, and this contradiction you can see across the board. Actually, they have this medieval, theological state, if you will, but they also are far more advanced than all of the Arab states combined in technology and industry. They're threatening the major powers by developing all kinds of sophisticated instruments. So it's a very interesting country. I mean, to study. I mean, if somebody has the time.
Another question?
Yeah, thank you. What is the role of the Constitution in Morocco and Islamic countries? Yeah, the Constitution now is taken seriously in Morocco, and Morocco responded to the winds of the Arab Spring by creating a constitutional council or committee, and they drafted the Constitution. It was contentious. I know some of the people who were involved, and then they came up with a constitution, and then it was approved in a plebiscite, and now it is being implemented. It is being implemented, and everybody seems to be serious about implementing it. I mean, there are gaps. People are still frustrated that they're not getting exactly what they were waiting for, but it's a process. It's a long process, and it's an interesting. The beauty of this constitution, and I think I wish I were able to hear my friends from Morocco who spend my time talk about Morocco, is Morocco excels in the art of ambivalence and ambiguity. It really does. I don't know whether am I saying it is your experience, but it is, it's all, in that sense, if there's one aspect of medieval culture that I like, it was the ability to say yes and no at the same time. I mean, in the highly rational West in the post-scientific revolution, the West of the post-scientific revolution, the Cartesian West, that ability vanished, because now it's things that have to be black or white, right or wrong, and stuff like. But very often, what Moroccans, it seems to me, they are able to live in that sea of grayness and so the Constitution says Islam is the official religion of the state, but the preamble of the Constitution, I don't know how many, I mean, pages long. It talks about the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and it's a multicultural society, the rights of women, the rights of children. So even if an Islamist were to come and say, well, it says here that Islam is but then somebody else would say, well, it says here too that this is it. So it's like, and then things end up canceling each other, and the society stays in a state of constitutional limbo. But, because of that limbo, I'm not thinking on my feet right now, then the king and the architects of the government could walk through that kind of impasse and create, and move ahead with the modernization process. So it's a very interesting situation to counter or to alleviate the negative effects of religion. Thank you. I mean, what can a Westerner do to make help the separation of state and religion in Muslim and Arab societies? Well, here's what I recommend, and I spoke to one of our friends here in the back, somewhere there, from SACO. It's basically, there you are. It's very often, here's what I do. Let me see if I can answer the question by talking about my own experiences. People often ask me to come to interfaith dialogue events, and I say I'm not the right person to go. I politely decline, because I am not an imam. I'm not a man of religion. If I were to go to places, I would be more of a critic than a preacher. So I go to help people analyze and understand their predicament, as opposed to saying, you're fine, let's understand each other. Now that's what the liberal media has been doing with all good intentions. I mean, we're all progressive and so on, but it has been doing. It sort of displaces the analysis and puts the blame on a very small fringe movement in the Islamic world, the terrorists, the fundamentalists, the Al-Qaeda types, but everybody else is peace-loving and not. I mean, and so what this is music to a lot of people's ears. And because, okay, fine, our religion is fine. The President of the United States says our religion is fine, and we are fine. Only a bunch of bad people on the margins here causing problems. So there's no need whatsoever for us to really re-examine our culture and our traditions. So it only reinforces that tendency. And I think it comes out of a very generous and benevolent attitude that a lot of people have towards the other. They don't want to feel discriminatory. They don't want to feel unduly harsh on people who are not like them. They go the extra mile to be sensitive to other people's cultures and traditions. But it's time, if I were to teach younger people in college now, it's time to move away from this paradigm, this way of thinking, into another way of thinking. It's time to begin thinking that we're all human beings, right? We're all divided by idiosyncratic cultural practices. But at the end, we all have a set of universal aspirations and needs. And it doesn't matter. I just read an article you probably have. I was talking to Neil earlier today in the science section of the Times yesterday. A primitive tribe in Venezuela, probably one of the last few left on Earth. They're completely, they don't wear clothing or anything. They just use arrows, and they're very as primitive as they get. They are still about a good number of them to live in separate villages. Well, they spent their entire lives raiding each other's villages. And when the anthropologists who spent 38 years with them asked why, they said because of women. We want their women. They basically raid the villages to get their women, because their women are in short supply and the big guy gets a few of them, and the other guys don't have enough of them, and so they raid each other's villages, because it is. So now, but this guy, the author of this book, he said, earlier in my career, I was given a hard time by my colleagues because my colleagues are mostly of a Marxist persuasion, and they thought these are the noble savages. They lived in total peace. They never wage war against each other. It is us, the civilized people, who have created all the problems in the world. And some of this attitude gets extended to other cultures and traditions. It doesn't help them. It really doesn't help, people to be very nice to them, and basically papering over some of what you see are problems that are bubbling just below the surface or even above it. So I think it's good to have a critical, universal mind. In other words, regardless of nation, and to be an equal opportunity critic. In other words, whether you are criticizing the President of the United States, or whether you're criticizing someone in the United States, or someone in Brazil, someone in India, in Morocco, and in China, it doesn't matter. If you have a set of convictions and beliefs, do not try to make exceptions for other people just because you want to be sensitive to their culture. It's the wrong approach. It is not fair, and in fact, it could even sound patronizing. So it doesn't help anybody. Yes, I didn't want to go.
Repeat the question.
Oh, he's asking me about southeastern countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, which have a lot of. Indonesia is probably the most populous Muslim country in the world, and Malaysia is a big Muslim population, not 100%, but a big chunk of it, and that part of the world where Islam is huge. There's Islam in China too, and so on. I told you before I didn't want to go beyond the Arab world, which ends in Iraq. But if you go to these countries, Malaysia and Indonesia, Indonesia is a very interesting place. Again, I wish I had a lot of time to say a lot about that country. Indonesia is, the latest thing I read, is slated to be one of the world's major economic powers within a very short period of time, in a decade and a half. It's moving economically. It's on the ascendancy. It's really going up. I mean, I was surprised when I read the statistics. But on the other hand, where you find incursions of Islamic fundamentalism in both these countries. Malaysia, there was an outrage about it 2 years ago when Christians in Malaysia used the word Allah for God. I don't know whether it's Malaysia or Thailand. I'm trying to remember now which country. And it was such an outcry by Muslims that they had. It turned into a huge problem. So Islamic fundamentalism is these countries who are deeply influenced by the Buddhist tradition and other Asian traditions, and now they have Islamic movements, a large Muslim population, and within this Muslim population there are fringes of the radicals and extremists. But these are people that have been making incursions and inroads into the mainstream, and they may be affecting the cultural, the tolerance of these societies, the historic culture of tolerance that existed in these societies negatively. So we got to watch that too. Even though they have been relatively immune from the sectarian and narrow ethnic, narrowness that has prevailed in the Arab world and the Middle East in general. So I think if Indonesia could maintain its system, and Malaysia as well, of openness and be aware of the Islamic fundamentalists there, it could be definitely a role model to a lot of Muslims in the world.
Another question?
Oh, thank you so much. What is the role of Al-Qaeda and its influence in the region? Al-Qaeda is a blend of two fundamentalist movements. I'm simplifying for the sake of simplicity. The two, in the 18th century, there appeared a religious sect in in the Arabian desert before there was a Saudi Arabia, led by a man called Abdul Wahab. I know it's Muhammad Abdul Wahab. He's a preacher who made a deal with one of the chieftains in the region from the family of Al Saud. They said, if I provide religious guidance, you provide political power, and the two of us will create a system that would shape the Arabian Peninsula. Well, they succeeded in the 20th century, and that movement. So now, even today in Saudi Arabia, you have the religious order is still shaped by the Wahhabi vision, and the political order indebted to it. It's a very strange. There's no other country in the world that's named after a family, the Ibn Saud family that I know of. And so the country is named after a family. And so it's, when you talk about how do you create a culture of freedom within a family, basically a family-ruled nation, it becomes very, very complicated. There goes the notion of citizenship. It's a very interesting notion, which is what the Arab world ultimately needs. So then you have that fact, and then in Egypt, following the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1924, and there was a gap in Islamic leadership. That gave rise to all kinds of attempts to fill the vacuum. And so in the late 20s in Egypt, they developed what's called the Muslim Brotherhood, founded by a guy called Benna, to create a sort of a Muslim order in the absence of any Islamic leadership in the Islamic world. So the Muslim Brotherhood now, for the first time in history, is ruling Egypt today. Morsi is a member of this Muslim Brotherhood. And then they developed intellectuals of the caliber of Sayyid Qutb, who began to rail against the West and its depredations and so on, and its culture of ignorance and its hedonism and all that stuff. So these two tendencies blended in the figure of Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was trained and educated. There was a school following the persecutions of the secular regime of Abdel Nasser. Some of these Muslim brothers went to Egypt to teach. So they became part of that culture, and out of that mixing of the Wahhabi and the Muslim Brotherhood culture, they developed some leadership, which eventually led to the making of Osama bin Laden. And it's not surprising that Osama bin Laden his eminence grise, or his guiding intellectual is Al-Zawahiri. He is he's an Egyptian. He came from the same culture. So together they formed this organization that espouses the narrowest forms of Islam. So you cannot understand Osama bin Laden without understanding the twin cultures of the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia and the Muslim Brotherhood. Osama bin Laden may live, he's dead. Osama bin Laden is dead, but these two cultures continue, and they're heavily funded. Not to forget, another player in this, there's a third player, invisible player, which is it's the United States. When the Taliban, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in the late 70s, 1970s, the United States, there was a very interesting alliance was created as a result. So Saudi Arabia, the United States, facilitated the spread of the Wahhabi cult globally, but especially to Afghanistan. And then they started funding the madrasas in Pakistan to train new kinds of, which was heavily Sufi society, to train people in the Wahhabi fundamentalist ways. And in all of this, in order to wage a jihad against the Soviets. And so there was an interesting alliance, which is why I call some of this Islam that ultimately appeared in Afghanistan and Pakistan, it's in some ways American Islam too, because it was created as an attempt to fight a war against the Soviets. And Saudi Arabia was permitted to spread its doctrine of Wahhabism globally, including in the United States. There were times when Zawahiri came to do fundraising in the United States. And remember, Reagan was calling them, like comparing them to the Taliban, to the founding fathers, if you remember an episode during the Reagan presidency. So it was a time when nobody expected. You know, even during the Carter administration, they said they thought nothing of supporting creating this fundamentalist movement to fight the Soviets, and nobody was afraid of a blowback. Brzezinski was asked about that. He said, "No, that's not. You know, who cares? It's never going to come back to haunt us." They were far more interested in the oil resources of the region. So we may talk about a simplified history of Wahhabism and the Muslim Brotherhood, but the United States played a hand in some of this, you know. And the United States always does things like most of us do, you know, for expedient political reasons, not because they believe in such things, and then eventually they come back to shape us and haunt us and do interesting things to us. So that's why that is why it is important to really to keep our eyes on the prize, which is the guiding principles of the United States. Even though the United States also has a lot of financial interest in the region, like oil and other things, and the security of Israel and stuff like that. So it's complex, but by and large, the United States has forged an alliance with the Saudis, Roosevelt and Ibn Saud, you know, earlier in the 20th century, one providing oil and the other to provide security. That alliance is still intact. And so the United States is not in a position to challenge the Saudi establishment to change its ways. And if Saudi Arabia doesn't change its ways, and it funds a lot of these Islamist movements, I don't know how we can try. And we'll try to, we'll do our best to change things anyway. Yeah, there are a lot of moderate Muslims.
No, the question.
Oh, are there any moderate Muslims? Because we don't hear a lot about them. And are they making an impact? Yes.
In the Arab countries and in the U.S.
In the Arab countries and in the U.S. There are a lot of moderate Muslims, but they're not making an impact. They're not making an impact because moderates very rarely do. I mean,
That's why they call it a silent majority.
you know, because they don't shape the agenda or the discussion, or they're not forceful enough. And we saw some of this effect during the last presidential election. Something happened at the last minute, but you know, for the longest time, things were like not going in the right direction. Because if you don't speak forcefully, and if you don't have a set of principles to guide you and define your movement, your action, your political action, you have a tendency of getting lost. And so it's best. So the strength of the fundamentalists of all stripes, whether they be political fundamentalists or religious fundamentalists or economic fundamentalists, they know exactly what they want. You know, they think this is what we want, and they go for it, you know, with a tenacity that overwhelms sometimes the moderates. And so people, the liberals or the progressives or the enlightened ones need to somehow, you know, defend their principles in a similar fashion in order to avoid a worse outcome for themselves and for the future of their nation. So I think that's what I think needs to be done. And I think that is what's missing in the Arab and Islamic world, and to some extent even in the United States. You know, I mean, you could see the liberals are very comfortable in their liberalism, but they do not really champion it the same way that people did, and again in the early days of the American Revolution. We all need to be Jefferson. I mean, it's like, you know, it is a necessity. It is the world calls for it, and in the case of and I think even for Americans now, you know, with all the challenges coming its way, particularly from China, You know, who wants to live in a China-dominated world? I mean, I say this with all respect. I mean, I have a tremendous respect for Chinese civilization, but it's going to be a very different civilization. And so these are the two gains. These are the two, you know, I've always said, I mean, I've come to the conclusion now that the Enlightenment was a brief moment, brief light in the long march of very often a dark history. And out of that brief moment came the American Revolution, and which inspired the French Revolution, which gave us a modern world, so to speak, with human rights and so on and so on, also with a tremendous amount of violence and abuses. So if we let go of that flicker of the Enlightenment that created this moment in history, and republics, at the end of the day, and we know from Roman history, are always threatened by a regression to some more autocratic forms of government. People have to take their lives and their futures and their systems seriously and defend them and be outspoken advocates for them, otherwise they may lose them. The same is true for Muslims.
I think we'll get handled one more question. Yes.
Turkey is a very interesting case. And I cannot speak about anything without having, my mind keeps pulling me in different directions. I want to answer that. I want to give you a very brief answer, but my mind keeps drawing me back to history. So modern Turkey emerged out of a dysfunctional and failed Ottoman Empire. There was an Ottoman Empire which ruled vast parts of the world, which was all over North Africa, the Middle East, and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, by the way, is what created the mess in the Middle East, and all the way to the gates of Vienna. And so the Ottoman Empire became a dysfunctional empire, and so it was being chipped away by the European powers. Eventually, it failed, it was colonized, and out of this chaos, there emerged a brilliant man, Kemal Atatürk. And he saved it at the last minute from foreign designs, unified Turkey, and abolished the caliphate, the Islamic rule in Iran. And he changed, of course, the alphabet. He decreed new dress for the Turks. He banished the fez from people's heads, and he created a constitution based on the Swiss model. And for his nation, he was determined to do away with the medieval Ottoman culture and turn this nation into a modern one. He gave up the empire completely, so he created the foundation of a modern nation. It is out, he's reviled now in Turkey by the Islamists, but it is out of those foundations that Turkey was able to emerge the way it has. People forget that. He left no children to replace him, and I always said, and I highly recommend a visit to the mausoleum of Kemal Atatürk in Ankara, and I'm sure some of you have gone there. He embodies, to me, he's like George Washington and Napoleon in one. It's a kind of a strange feeling you get being in that mausoleum. But he not only led revolutions and fought, but he changed the alphabet, and he did all kinds of things and he went around in the villages helping people write the new alphabet. So he was a great visionary. He was highly admired by European contemporaries, and he wanted to establish a modern nation. To establish a modern nation in the midst of a deeply religious and medieval society, you needed a firm hand. That firm hand is still guiding Turkey. And it has led to the good fortunes of the Islamists who are ruling the government right now. And I hope they don't, once again, they don't give up this legacy, because they don't think highly of him. In fact, they dislike him tremendously. And it would be a mistake. Bourguiba did the same thing. The Arab world had a Kemal Atatürk of sorts. It is Bourguiba in Tunisia in the 1950s. He's the one who created the new constitution. He gave women their rights. He gave people the choice to fast or not to fast during Ramadan and all that kind of stuff. And he's still reviled by the Islamic fundamentalists. So Islam, that's why I say Islam, moderation it's kind of more problematic than not, because if the Muslims do not examine their traditions fully and re-evaluate them in the light of new knowledge, new science, and new knowledge, they are not going to be very helpful in creating the spaces of freedom, culture. And why do we need the space of space of freedom and of freedom in these societies? Because without freedom, there can never be any innovation. And without innovation, you cannot have a strong economy, and you cannot reach that prosperity and power that Muslims and Arabs have been dreaming of for the last 2 centuries or more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.